Welcome, Cody. I'm really excited to have you on our Hangar podcast. We've been talking to each other quite lot recently, and you were also one of our speakers in our Hangar DX sessions. So I'm really excited to dive into this and record in podcast format. So why don't you start with your quick introduction, and we will dive into details of your work.
Yeah, sounds good. I'm super happy to be here. My name is Cody Ray. I'm a senior manager in an engineering team at Confluent. We build data streaming systems. Specifically, my team is service foundations. Call it platform engineering, call it whatever you want. But I'm trying to make our whatever hundreds of engineers much more productive.
Amazing. And one of the things I learned about your background is you've been at Confluent for a fairly long time. So tell us a bit more about like history of evolution of dev platform or dev engineering, or like how your engineering team itself has grown and kind of like some of the scaling challenges that came with it. But just give us a like rundown of since you joined Confluent to where it is today.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah. So when I joined, it was in 2017, and there was no Confluent Cloud, and I was definitely not working on developer productivity. I don't even think I'd heard the term at the time. We had 8 people who were building Confluent Cloud from scratch, and it was a super fun time. As the team grew and as we kind of found market traction, we were running as fast as we could to see if there was even market appetite. We built a lot of stuff, some of it good, some of it not as good. Of course, it's at the core of your system, which means that the not as good stuff sticks around for a long time. I've often said that my job has been undoing some bad earlier decisions that I made and kind of paying penance for those. But over time, I ended up working towards the customer, like started literally as an SRE, although there's 8 of us, so like we're all building infrastructure in an infrastructure space. Eventually we got rid of the notion of SREs for the most part, walked up towards the user. So I was embarrassed that we didn't have public APIs or a public CLI as an infrastructure as a service company. So I bootstrapped a CLI team, bootstrapped an API team. And then at that point we'd grown massively. Like we, I was 160, 170th employee, and now we're at, I don't know, thousands of employees and hundreds of engineers. And I'm like, why are we not moving faster? Like, why are we struggling with quality? So I eventually, anger driven, developed myself into a service foundations role or a platform engineering role, trying to help the rest of the engineers be much more productive. How can I 10x other people instead of just being productive myself?
That's amazing. So I know platform engineering and DevX engineering, and there are like many different ways of defining this. Almost every company defines it differently. How does Confluent define platform engineering today?
Yes, we actually don't even use the term platform engineering today. So we have a developer productivity org, which in theory is about making our developers be able to move faster. In practice, we've had so many security initiatives. They're like securing the supply chain for software and working with vendors, and that's kind of been one of our internal struggles. Our core developer productivity org grew out of like our original tooling team because we sold software you could run self-manage on your own cloud or on premise. So that was the origins, right? Packaging and those sort of things and build systems. I come from the other side of like I built a lot of the applications, so my team tends to be much closer towards that side of the world, right? How do we from kind of from the ground up, from the Kubernetes up towards the cloud provider? Not so much in the infrastructure space, or we try to avoid being too much in there. So how do I build new Golang services, new Java services? What are the standard frameworks we use? How do we integrate, right? So I tend to think of our team as glue. We have all these specialized teams thinking about logging and observability and security and reliability. Like, how do we take all these different best practices instead of asking our users to put all of them together? How do we actually combine them into a single interface that our developers can use? So that's where our team is really coming in, is thinking about things from the user perspective, from the developer perspective, because we're mostly people who have built apps here already.
Got it. And is your team then that developer productivity team, or is there more than your team that actually does developer productivity?
Yeah, we have 3 teams within the developer productivity org now. So
Okay.
my team is the one that's like closest to the applications. We have another team that is doing a lot of the build infrastructure, running our CI systems, um, interacting with those vendors. The supply chain hardening was on their team, for example. And then our third team is around a lot of like optimizations of detecting flaky tests, things along that side. Although, as we're starting to grow together, we're taking some of these application specific parts and splitting them across teams, right? So like one of those teams I'm now trying to get to help working on like database as a service type setup, for
Interesting.
example. Yeah.
Interesting. So Confluent is definitely an interesting company where, I mean, you folks build Kafka and some folks run it, I'm guessing, self-hosted systems as well. So share a bit about like, is there something which makes platform engineering or dev productivity more challenging? Is there like kind of like a different set of challenges that your organization has to face because of like how
Yeah.
Confluent runs?
Most of the industry tooling is like I have a GitOps thing that runs inside of a single Kubernetes, and that's my prod environment, and I may have another Kubernetes for dev and another for staging. Uh, our model is our customers run in all three cloud providers, and they have however many Kafka deployments. And if they want private ones, they'll have their own Kubernetes cluster depending on how it's set up under the hood. It's not in their account, but they can get very specific to like, I want to be very, very isolated, where we will give them that level of isolation on our side, which means that we're dealing with thousands or tens of thousands, I don't even know how many more, very, very large scale number of Kubernetes clusters. So all the normal like DevOps infrastructure that you expect does not really fit our scale or our deployment topology out of the box. So we have to do lots of customization for that.
Very interesting. So service runtimes, that's something that you specifically your team focuses on. Share a bit
hmm
more about like what does service runtimes even mean?
Sure. Um, so if we go back to the notion of glue, then the service runtime is like a, I don't know, a kitchen sink library almost
Mhm.
that attaches how you're supposed to, in our case, authenticate with your database, right? So we're you don't want to use static credentials anywhere for our security policies. This embeds that notion. And in our case, there might be another underlying library, but how you glue all of it together. Same thing for like customer facing features for audit logs, right? We need to be able to emit audit logs for our customers to see what actions were taken both by them or if we automate it, have an automated process that takes actions. So it's kind of like the glue integration inside of your service itself so that you don't have to go through this massive how do I talk to this and how do I talk to this. But more importantly than just providing that glue is it also provides a structured framework for disabling these integrations for testing. Like I only want to test this particular integration or I want to run my service locally without needing to run the entire world. And that's a big challenge in a like heavy microservice environment like we're in. So it gives you some of these quality of life aspects as an engineer as well.
That's interesting. I know we have talked a little bit about this also in our Hanger Zoom sessions.
Mhm.
And I know there is this concept coming originally from Netflix, I believe, which is like, okay,
Yeah.
how do we make it easier and more structured for other developers to create new services? So
Mhm.
is that kind of like the same principle of service runtimes in some ways, or kind of like was that sort of the evolution of this? And I think sort of a related secondary question to this is this type of a framework, who would this be relevant for? Let's say if any of the audience folks is thinking about, okay, do I need this in my organization? When does a framework like this become more relevant?
Yeah, so we there was definitely inspiration from like Netflix OSS and some of those older systems that I remember from earlier in my career. They don't get as much airtime as they used to, but I think it was called Governator or something like that. Netflix also had a bunch of OSS components that you could tie together, and then Governator, if that's even the right project, was the glue for all of their components, like RKS for dynamic configuration, Ribbon for service discovery. I forget what was in their system, but it's the same concept of I need to bootstrap a new service. We say bootstrap as developers really, really like to think about bootstrapping. Bootstrapping is a day zero problem. It's not what you're living with the rest of your life. Evolution is actually the bigger thing, right? Otherwise, we just have a bootstrap template and we bootstrap it from a new template and then you'd go do your own thing. Because we're putting it into a library, it means that as new platform maturities are added, they can be added with just like a version bump in your service if you pay attention to backward compatibility. So it's easy to sell bootstrapping, but the actual benefit for your company is usually around getting out of migration hell or reducing migration hell as much as possible.
When you think about migration, does that mean the third party library migration, or do you think about it as migration of like internal services as well?
All of the above, yes. It's not just like a Renovate bot doing a version bump on a third-party library. Like there are tools for that. It's more like we're going through BCPDR. I'll just give you a real example right now. we're trying to improve how we handle failovers. And we obviously, when you have hundreds of microservices, it's very inefficient to have to update hundreds of microservices for every one of these cross-cutting concerns, right? Like if I want to be in a passive mode, I don't want to have to do that. If I have a library that's embedded in each of them, then I can add another middleware, for example, to all of them with just a version bump. And then I can use RenovateBot or something like that to do that version bump. So it lets us actually move faster in that direction. There is a
Very
gotcha.
interesting. Go ahead.
If you go too far with this in your library approach, even if you're in a single language, you end up building a distributed monolith. So the thing that I tell my team regularly is we're putting things in the service runtime, but our real goal is to get them across the network divide, because I don't want to have to do coordinated upgrades across services. And while you can kind of engineer around that for a lot of these things, the more that you get it into like an actual component that's independently deployed by a platform team, and the less logic that actually is in the deployment owned by your service team, the better. So runtimes are easy because they're in your service and it's what you as an engineer already think about. As you're building your platform, we're trying to move more of that logic out into like central platform owned components.
Interesting. Migration becomes a big challenge almost for every organization at a certain scale. And I think it's kind of like both internal upgrades and external upgrades. Um, where do you draw the line in terms of like one of the key challenges, which I've also heard from many organizations, especially for dev platform teams, is most of the migrations just fall on their bucket, right? Like if there's a security issue, also dev platform teams end up becoming, because they're a horizontal team, they become the team that actually manages these things. How do you folks handle this? Like, do you have like any best practices? Are there like ways through which you can encourage product teams to also take over ownership of some of these migrations?
So what I was just saying will help with this. If you don't have code distributed across 1,000 services, then you don't have to migrate 1,000 services, right? If you can isolate it into like a single service with 6 replicas or 10 replicas, whatever you need, then that's much easier for the platform team to migrate and own. Where I think it becomes a real challenge is when the platform team is expected to go make updates to all of the service owner stuff, and that becomes a nightmare. Like even when you automate PRs, they still have to be reviewed,
Right.
merged, deployed, which means you end up building infrastructure just to figure out if, like, even if they've merged the PR, if it's actually been deployed or if you still have the security vulnerability. Um, so that's one of the challenges we're still trying to grapple with here. But that's why we're trying to move things across that network divide.
Very interesting. So, folks who are listening for this, would you recommend building a service runtime, or like kind of like maybe what is a scale where something like this becomes more useful and meaningful?
I think it depends on your rate of new services. One, that's how you get funding, right? If I'm creating, I think whenever I presented this, we'd created 70 new services in the last year. And at this point, it's like 30 services a quarter or something, pretty high. Um,
Wow.
yeah. But then the flip side is you also don't want to encourage a mass proliferation. Like you don't want more services than engineers. And that's a tricky balance to figure out. I heard our CEO early in my time here said like a rule of thumb that he used to use was you want at least 5 engineers per every service and just like leave it fully staffed. Otherwise, you get services left behind. They're just maintenance mode. Nobody really owns them. So one of the nice things of having a service runtime, like a single framework that the different services are using, is it makes it a little easier to do this refactoring, right? To combine services that logically could be together or to separate services as you need to actually pull them apart to have different teams. Because the entire purpose of microservices, if you go back to the original thought leaders, was to allow teams to move more independently and like at their own speed with their own deployment speed and everything like that. But where I think the lie was is that it lets you use your own tech stack. You will not if you have your own tech stack. At least not in a B2B, highly secure, reliable enterprise environment. Um, whenever you have when you have policies that every single service needs to meet, then implementing those policies in a very heterogeneous environment becomes almost impossible to do.
Right. I mean, even at Google, when we had thousands of microservices there where people are creating services almost on a daily basis, like there was some standardization. You cannot like just go have wild west, because then, yes, it's a security nightmare, it's a maintenance nightmare, and there's only so much people can even support.
Mhm.
Right.
Even if you have the best of intentions, you as a service owner probably don't know all the platform requirements.
Right. So I mean, this is already going into a little bit into sort of like the social aspect of many of these things. So there's two aspects to it. Like when we talk about the social challenges, one is like convincing the leadership that this is a problem worth solving and investing into. And I think the flip side is also how do you even convince developers to adopt these tools once you build them, right? And these libraries and these frameworks. So share a bit about both of those aspects. So like, how do you convince, I would say, the developers to adopt and use these new frameworks, and then also how do you even convince leadership to even invest into building these frameworks?
It's not easy. But when we talk about bootstrapping, leaders understand bootstrapping because you're reducing time to market. That is your selling point to your leadership. Um, the way that the projects literally got started, though, is a Christmas break hack project. And then we had people adopting it because it made their lives easier, like individual contributors adopting it because it made their lives easier. And then that kind of proved it out. And then once we had that initial buy-in, like our early adopters, we got real funding for it from leadership. So, like many projects, it started as a skunkworks project. And then we did that for Go, and now we're doing it for Java because people saw, oh, my team's much more productive using this in Go. Now I want this for my Java developers. ICs, depending on the level of IC, is easier or harder to convince. Junior ICs are like, cool, you show me how to do it. You made my life easier. They haven't yet formed a lot of really strongly held opinions because at the end of the day, what we're talking about kind of comes down to local optimization versus global optimization. Uh, Low, yeah, like more junior ICs, they just want to get shit done. The senior ICs, they have a lot of well-formed opinions and like they know particular technology. They're usually a little bit harder to convince on some of these until you realize, well, until you kind of talk about it from this perspective, right? Moving faster as an organization where there's like, then this hit this last 1% for my particular team's use case. So that's the trade-off.
Nice. So it sounds a little bit like, even how you operate in startups is like you find sort of like some early adopters to try out the
Exactly.
product, be sort of like your design partners, you build technology around that, and then eventually show value for other people to uh, like see that value and also get convinced.
Yeah, exactly. We consider ourselves like entrepreneurs in our company where we go and talk to all the teams and say, what do you need? Like, give us your feedback. And then we iterate constantly. Like, I want to get to early adopters as fast as possible. If I don't have a use case for a technology or for a new system or tool or part of the platform, we probably shouldn't be building it.
That's amazing. So I want to double click a little bit more into this. How do you recommend like dev prod leaders or like folks who are just starting building this type of an organization? What's a good way to build this type of a culture of like, okay, we are actually like constantly getting feedback and we are kind of like building through this, like, so maybe even taking a step back before service runtime even came about, like tell us like a
Mhm.
bit more of evolution of like how did you even come up with this framework, and
Mhm.
what kind of like research and you did, and like how did you find some of the early adopters?
Sure. I'll actually give you an example that's related. We have this Project Pyramid testing project where we had heard through our developer productivity surveys for a couple of years that testing sucks. And that's literally all you can really say in this high level survey. Everything is extremely like not detailed. So this was probably our most structured approach to getting this sort of detailed feedback we needed. But we went and interviewed probably 30 different teams across the company, as well as, I don't know, 4 or 5 external companies that were struggling with this problem to understand what does it mean when you say testing is hard on your team? What are you doing? What's working well? For us, almost exclusively, that came down to running tests in shared environments, end-to-end tests in particular. So that is how we actually got this particular project funded, which builds on the service runtimes we were just talking about. So that's one way, right? I think that leaders often over-index on quantitative data, which is very hard in our space. So one of the big differences between big companies and small companies is the level of trust you give engineers, and that trust really comes down to whether you're going to trust qualitative data or not. I mean, that's one of the things that if you can find some trusted leaders in your company who may not be execs, but like high level ICs, like tenured folks, and they can concentrate the feedback and aggregate it for leadership. That has been kind of our approach right now because numbers haven't been motivating people, but stories do.
Very interesting. And does your organization or like dev prod in general have a product manager, or is that something sort of like you yourself do, and sort of like who typically like drives some of these product initiatives?
Yeah, that is definitely a role that I've been wearing. We don't have one. We actually just had a town hall on it within our organization about now that we have this reorg where all of our different platform teams are under one roof. Do we get a product manager? Do we get like tech writers? Like a lot of these things where if we want to envision ourselves as like a standalone entity, providing a product to our customer focused teams, so to speak, that you would want. But we don't have one today.
Interesting. So how do you do roadmap planning?
Talk to lots of people. Talk to lots and lots of people. And then try to figure out which of the use cases, well, A, which of the use cases are most common across different teams, and B, which of the use cases are going to have a higher impact on the company. So this we often talk about paved paths, right? So like if people have already walked there, then you know that there's some impact because there's already 5 teams. But sometimes there's a team that's going through the jungle with a machete, and your company is betting the farm on that team, and you want to try to go there with them, and pick up the machete and start laying the gravel behind you as you go. So it's not always who has the most use cases. Sometimes it is just where the company's betting the farm, or where you're putting more of the upside of the future company results too.
That's very cool. So you kind of hinted a little bit on the impact side, and we were also talking earlier about like KPIs. Sometimes like even quantitative metrics aren't really like the right way to understand a problem or severity of an issue. Um, what's how have you been using kind of like this impact or like presenting this impact for both leadership and just in general, like showing kind of like the impact your team is making for the rest of the organization?
Yeah, the easiest way is we have a culture at the company of celebrating new launches like most companies do, but we do it in an engineering specific way where we say like these are the teams that we built on and like these are the teams that help support. So one of the easy heuristics is like how many times does our people, our team, our tooling get called out there, right? Another one is one of the reasons that KPIs are hard in developer productivity is ideally we want as much done before you've even pushed code anywhere on a laptop as possible, right? That inner loop, more you can optimize that, the better, but it's really hard to get good instrumentation on that, especially when you have a bunch of different IDEs that people use and different frameworks, like things that aren't even related to like the actual code you're deploying. Um, so a lot of that is through storytelling. We've had a couple of town halls this year where I'll take people who use our systems and we'll put them in front of all of engineering, and they'll give it like a 2 to 5 minute, like, here's how this thing helped me, right? Something that would have taken me in the old system a few days to debug this issue, I was able to reproduce in 5 minutes because I was able to run my system locally and actually set my breakpoint in my debugger and my IDE. So a lot of it has been a mix of qualitative and quantitative. It's like gut feels from users. Like we'll have users say, "Oh yeah, this was a 10x speed up compared to this and a 100x speed up compared to this." And they'll say like, 30 seconds, 5 minutes down to 30 seconds. And they'll give rough estimates, but it's not like a 46% of speed up in time of deliverable to production or something, which is usually where dev prod metrics focus.
That's very cool. So kind of like showing some of these stories and demoing the use cases in front of rest of the engineering. I think that's a pretty cool idea. I don't think I've heard of that very commonly because generally, in platform teams, most folks say is developers only care about platform teams when things are not going well. When things are going well, nobody really cares about it.
Correct.
So, so I think it's good to kind of like also being able to show that impact through these storytellings and examples. So that's a very interesting perspective. I do want to touch a little bit on the testing as well, given that you brought in Project Pyramid. So, uh, do you have like any like philosophy practices for testing that you recommend, or it's kind of like depends a lot on the use cases? Are there like kind of any specific type of practices that you internally preach for at Confluent?
Yeah, the high level idea is that we want to be able to test as much locally as possible. If you have to build a Docker image and deploy it to a shared environment, well, to even an isolated environment that's just yours, you've got a really slow feedback loop. So the faster the feedback loop, the better. Like if I can get a feedback loop under 30 seconds or under 5 seconds, that's great, right? If I'm in an IDE, I can run a single test versus like running a make target or something that runs all of my tests, which may be minutes, tens of minutes, depending on your test setup. So that's the high level. How you do that really depends on use cases. So like if you're talking about synchronous communication versus async pipelines versus integration with cloud providers, et cetera. But for the most part, it's how do you get as much locally as possible?
What has been the biggest impact internally with some of your initiatives for testing from testing perspective for the developers?
Sure. Why we wrote a lot of end-to-end tests, that was the first level of like real functional testing. Like if you look at the test pyramid, you've got, unit tests, we had, hundreds, thousands, millions of unit tests. And then the next level was like end-to-end test where we see it with everything. So what we were trying to do is really get this much closer to the bottom, but at a higher granularity than individual units. So going back to this notion of we're a microservice environment, that means that each microservice should have a well-defined contract. So how do I test that as a black box instead of doing my first functional testing, like where I see my entire service together in an end-to-end test? So we wrote frameworks for component tests, which literally would spin up our service in the same process as the testing suite, using the same main, because Lord knows all the wiring needs to be tested. That's a very common breaking point. Using the same main, using as much of the same code as possible. But when you're running in fake mode, we have this notion of a plugin, which for every external dependency would replace the external with a fake, with giving you control over like what the types of responses are. And the other benefit that now that our execs are thinking a lot more about reliability and that sort of stuff, I keep harping on the fact that you can actually do a lot better edge case testing and error testing and improve your reliability than you can in a shared environment.
So, is there like some philosophy in terms of code coverage and like what how do you define like test health? How do you define like is do we have enough tests? Are there any thoughts around what things should be tested, what things should not be tested? Yeah, and kind of like code
Mm-hmm.
coverage, those kind of things.
Yeah, so we use Sonar Cube for code coverage.
Mm-hmm.
The challenge with getting anything that's not just unit tests is that code coverage is primarily for unit tests. um, if you're in process, though, and this is something we haven't quite got to, if you're running the test in process, you can run your unit test suite, which will produce like a profile with your coverage, and then you can run your component test suite, which will produce a profile for your coverage. So you could do something like that, which is something we're talking about for the future. For the most part, if you step back and think about it, though, your service is providing an API, which means that every API endpoint that you expose, whether it's REST or whether it's gRPC or GraphQL, it doesn't really matter. Every API operation you expose needs to be tested. So that's kind of like the bare bones of it. Where it gets tricky to measure and why you need like the intelligence of a developer is you need to think about how these are called in sequence to do one of the user's workflows. Like as a user, I need to create this thing and then I'm going to do something else. And then I need to be able to list it. Maybe I need to paginate across it, right? I don't call one endpoint and done. Systems would be
Right.
very simple if that was the case. So that's the thing that I don't know that there is a good KPI for it other than a user thinking about, sorry, other than an engineer thinking about your user's journey. And that's where like product, like the old product stories, QA type stories and engineers would really meet. And that's probably something that we've lost as we've had everything shift left to engineers.
I love like your aspect of like whole storytelling to evangelize some of these dev productivity initiatives and in general kind of like many of these practices because I think that is definitely very underutilized today in organizations. So with that, like maybe share a bit about what's next, what's coming up in your team specifically and dev productivity generally at Confluent. What are some of the bigger challenges that your team is trying to solve? Like yeah, like share a bit more about your roadmap for the next few quarters or a year.
Sure. So there's a couple of different dimensions this is going to go along. So we started very close to the application with service runtime. So we're in the service, and now we are going across the network divide, as I was saying, which means one, we have rolled out a service mesh recently, and we're adding more and more functionality into it. So we're kind of tying that back in with the pipelines, like the deployment pipelines, rollbacks, canaries. That's where a lot of teams have been asking for. Before now, all of our pipelines have been very flexible, which means like you figure out what you want to do, not very opinionated. And we're trying to take some of the best practices that people are asking for and apply them intelligently into our pipelines. So that's one area. The other is around more low-level infrastructure automation. So we talked about being deployed across all the cloud providers. There are multiple projects right now that are trying to do regional deployments, which means how do I deploy this exact same thing in 90 regions as well? And beforehand, it's been like duct tape and bubble gum that we've kind of done this through. I mean, a bunch of Terraform intermixed with runbooks with some manual CLI operations, and not anything that's really easily maintained or replicated across use cases. So now that we have enough of these use cases that we've seen and we've macheted through the jungle a few times, now we're going to start trying to lay those paths out. Those are the two of the really big ones that are on our immediate near-term horizon.
Awesome. I'm very much looking forward to like some of those things as well. And do you folks open source and share about like any of your engineering practices through blogs or open source projects?
Sometimes, but not really from our developer productivity team.
I see.
Because we're a tech company, most of our tech blogs are focused on like the tech we're providing, um, a lot of which is open source.
Nice. Okay, I know coming close to time, so let's if you have let's try to cover at least some of the rapid fire questions,
Okay.
and we can wrap it up.
Sure.
So, are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay, so share a bit about like what are you most excited about in the dev productivity as a space in the coming quarters or next few years?
Engineers are starting to think about other engineers as their customer first and foremost, which is very cool because it enables so many use cases that we could never solve before.
Interesting. And what makes a good engineer working in dev productivity?
Empathy, lots of empathy, and the ability to synthesize requirements because typically, I mean, as you asked earlier, we don't have a product manager. We have a bunch of teams that we're trying to synthesize before, and we get that's the power and the responsibility. We get a lot of leeway to make decisions because we are our customers in a lot of ways. But we also need empathy for our customers who may not be, neckbeards or have this much experience with this part of the stack, etc.
Nice. What's your take on coding assistants, like AI-powered coding assistants, and also generally, do you have any thoughts and opinions on like LLM, the use cases for developer productivity?
I think they can be very powerful. Uh, they seem to be. I heard it put in a video once that they're really, really good for engineers who are already solid engineers. Like they can spot mistakes in it. They may be troublesome for newer engineers who may say, go write this algorithm. They don't realize, oh, this actually doubled the space complexity, right? They don't know what the algorithm looks like. They don't have as good at debugging capabilities. In a lot of ways, it makes this go from writing code to reading code, which is not a lot of engineers' favorite part of the thing. They're not just doing more code reviews at this point, but it definitely helps you bootstrap quickly.
Interesting. And what about the any other use cases for LLM uh, that you think could be interesting for dev productivity?
I think the explain what this code is doing part that I've seen in a number of vendor demos is pretty useful. It's not always easy to read other people's code. I hope this doesn't decrease the amount of effort people put into making readable code, but I do think that's very helpful.
Amazing.
Also, analyzing every company I've been at has this docs problem where there's docs everywhere in 15 different systems. I've seen some very good use cases, including some tools in our own company for like summarizing what the current state is across all of these docs without you spending hours and hours reading.
That's awesome. So that brings me to the next question, which is, what's your favorite tool for dev productivity today?
For dev productivity, oh man, I don't know. I don't really take a tool centric view on that. The search thing I was just talking about was called Glean. Glean AI is very, very useful for searching across our docs. It's been a game changer to our company, I think.
That's awesome. And last question: do you have any books that you recommend, and preferably around dev productivity, but could also be general around business practices?
One of my favorite recommended books is called Release It. It's design patterns. I like design patterns. That's the thing that I really like to recommend people. Tooling's going to change, languages change, but design patterns are pretty flexible to be reused. And Release It it's not how to build a single service, it's how to build like a system so that you don't have cascading failures and like all of these things that we often see as platform engineers, that if you're working in the confines of a single service, you're like, my service didn't do anything. And you realize it's the interaction that causes issues. So it goes through lots of design patterns about how to identify that and avoid it.
That's very cool. I don't think I've heard of this book, so I'm going to definitely add that to my list of reading, and I'll put the link of the book in the show notes as well. So, thank you so
Yeah,
much, Cody. This was fun. Really appreciate you spending some of this time. I hope our audience also enjoyed it. And Cody, I'll see you in one of our other Hangar DX sessions.
excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much for this. It's been
Thank you
fun.
for the time. Bye.